Bonjour à tous and welcome to this video all about the word about, which is notoriously difficult to translate into French, and it's no wonder really considering the number of uses it has in English. For example, let's talk about it. I'll be there at about 8. There are about 7 billion people in the world. What do you think about this? You're going about it the wrong way. What are you thinking about? Etc, etc. I could go on all day. About is abundant in English, and naturally French treats it in a slightly different way. So we're going to go through some of the most common uses of about in English, and then how to translate them into French, or rather how not to translate them, and I'll talk to you about that a little bit more later on. First though, I want to introduce you to phrasal verbs, which, as the name suggests, are verbs which are phrases. They're made up of more than one word, and generally we take a verb which on its own has a meaning, we add a word after it known as a particle, and from that we make a new verb with a new meaning. And English has many of these. The Wikipedia page on English phrasal verbs lists more than 2,000. And as you can see here, the particles take many shapes and forms. We have in, on, up, down, around, and about. And many of the uses of about in English are in these phrasal verbs. For example, to talk about. So we have a verb which has meaning on its own, to talk, meaning to converse or to communicate, and then we add about and we get a new meaning, which is something more like to discuss. And in French, to talk about is parler de. So for example, je parle de Marc, I'm talking about Marc. On parle du film, we're talking about the film. And you see we have a similar thing going on in French as well. We have parler, which on its own means to speak or to talk, and then parler de, to speak or to talk about. So many people at this stage will say, okay then, about is just de. But that's not necessarily the case. For example, to think about something is penser à quelque chose. So je pense à ma voiture, I'm thinking about my car. So now we have two possible translations for about. But then we have another problem, because if you look up de or à in a dictionary, you probably won't find about. De on its own generally means of or from, and à is at or to. So we have a problem here. It gets even worse when we find out that we can actually say penser de. This is to think about something in the sense of having an opinion. It's more like to think of. Qu'est-ce que tu penses de ma voiture? What do you think of my car? And quite often you'll hear people say, qu'est-ce que tu en penses? What do you think of it? Where en stands for de ma voiture. So now we have some conflicting translations. We have de meaning about, de meaning of, à meaning about. So going through this translation process really doesn't work. Another note on to think about, we can also have réfléchir à. This is a slightly deeper thought, it's more like reflection. So, je réfléchis à ce que je vais faire. I'm thinking about what I'm going to do, in the sense that it's not just in my head, but I'm really going over it in my mind and considering different possibilities and things. So, the point with these is, remember that they are phrasal verbs. So remember them as phrases, not as verbs with words attached. Okay, so to talk about something is parler de quelque chose. To think about something, penser à quelque chose, or depending on the context, penser de quelque chose and réfléchir à quelque chose. But then of course that's not the only use of the word about. In English it can also mean approximately, and for this we have a few options. You could go over a simple approximativement. So for example, il y a approximativement 100 personnes dans la salle. There are approximately 100 people in the room. But this is very long, and personally I really don't like long adverbs. Approximativement is way too syllables for my liking. And remember, in French, the more you can shorten things, the better. So you probably won't hear people say this very much. It's very much sort of a written thing, in the same way that approximately is quite formal in English. Instead, you could use environ. Okay, so il y a environ 100 personnes dans la salle, much shorter, much nicer. Or you could use à peu près, which means exactly the same thing. Il y a à peu près 100 personnes dans la salle. It's highly likely that there are minute, negligible differences between these, but negligible being the operative word, don't worry, they're all pretty much synonymous. Then we have the case of vers, which can also be used to mean about. For example, on se retrouve vers 10 heures. Now, this means we will meet at about 10 o'clock or around 10 o'clock. Vers literally means towards. For example, in the second sentence we have je vais vers Paris, I'm going towards Paris. But when we're talking about time, we don't use environ or à peu près or approximativement. We generally use vers, towards a certain time. Next, we have the use of about, meaning on the subject of, and again we have a few options here. First of all, we have au sujet de, which is almost a literal translation of on the subject of. So for example, il a écrit un livre au sujet de la pollution. He's written a book on the subject of pollution. And this one always makes me think of one of the opening scenes in the film Les Choristes, which is a film I highly recommend, by the way. So let's just have a look at that clip.
Oui. Pierre, un appel de France, c'est urgent. Après le concert. C'est au sujet de votre mère. Oui.
So we heard c'est au sujet de votre mère. It's on the subject of your mother. It's about your mother. I think that's quite a nice use of that one. Alternatively, we can use à propos de, which is pretty much synonymous again. Il a écrit un livre à propos de la pollution. Or we could be really simple and just use sur, meaning on. And we do this in English. Il a écrit un livre sur la pollution. He's written a book on pollution. Okay, on and about, in this sense, are quite often synonymous. Now these are fine. Use them as much as you like. But some people do have a tendency to overuse them. For example, they'll say things like je parle à propos de ce livre. I'm talking about this book. But remember, we just learnt that to talk about is parler de. So using à propos de, though it's grammatically okay, it's kind of redundant. There's no need for the à propos, just say je parle de ce livre. So if there's a simpler way of saying it, use it, because otherwise it just sounds really wordy and heavy. However, in these situations, he's written a book about, then you can use any one of these. Now as it happens, there is an article that has been written about au sujet de, à propos de, une analyse lexicographique, discursive et linguistique. It's actually quite interesting. It's not too long, really. So if you want to read about the very subtle differences between au sujet de and à propos de, do. It is in French, by the way. But really, à propos de, au sujet de, for all intents and purposes, are the same. Then, finally, we have the case of il s'agit de, which when people learn it, it tends to become their favourite phrase, and so they overuse it and they use it incorrectly. So I thought we'd take some inspiration from the news today to have a look at some of the uses of il s'agit de. It's a very journalistic phrase. So for example, we have here il s'agit d'une véritable opération de croissance qui profitera aux deux entreprises. Okay, so we're talking here about a proposal that's going to be put into place regarding transport and things. The details are not important. Here, il s'agit de is being used to explain something. So previously in this paragraph we've been told about this proposal, and then we have this explanation. Il s'agit de, a veritable operation of growth which will be profitable to both companies. As it happens, really, we wouldn't translate il s'agit de here. All it's doing is introducing an explanation as to what something is. Similarly, here we have a quote from the man himself, François Hollande. Il ne s'agit pas de choisir entre les Drians et Sapin, mais de choisir l'entrée de la France. Here, he's kind of saying it's not a question of. Okay, it's not a question of choosing between le Drian et Sapin. Drian, Sapin, they are two politicians. Mais de choisir l'intérêt de la France, but to choose the interest of France. Okay, it's not a question of. It's not about choosing between these two, but choosing the interest of France. Okay, so we have the sense of about there. And you'll see that an awful lot in newspapers and news articles in general. However, in everyday speech, we can also use it to talk about what something is about. The problem is, though, people tend to make a lot of mistakes, so they'll say things like "Ce livre s'agit d'un garçon qui devient un sorcier puissant," thinking they're saying this book is about a boy who becomes a powerful wizard. The problem with this, though, is that il s'agit de is an impersonal expression. You cannot separate the il from the s'agit de. It's like saying something like the sky is raining. Okay? We don't say it is raining. What this it refers to, we don't know. It's an expletive, okay? It's there as a dummy subject. It's not doing anything, and you can't get rid of the it from it is raining. Something cannot rain. Likewise, the clouds do not snow. It's just it is snowing. And it works in the same way with il s'agit de. We can't get rid of the il. Okay, now that doesn't mean you can say ce livre, il s'agit d'un garçon qui devient un sorcier puissant. Okay, instead you have to say dans ce livre, il s'agit d'un garçon qui devient un sorcier puissant. Okay, dans whatever it is, it's not necessarily a book, it could be a film, a poem, anything. It is about a boy who becomes a powerful wizard. The point here is to remember that il does not stand for the thing that you're talking about. Okay, in the same way that it, in It Is Raining, does not refer to the sky or the clouds. It is just there because it is. Okay, so you can just remember the structure. Dans, whatever, il s'agit de, blah, blah, blah. So hopefully this video has been helpful to you. Of course, there are many more uses of about that I simply don't have the time to go through. If there are particular cases that you want to ask about, do put a comment. As usual, all your feedback is very welcome, and I'll see you next time. À bientôt.